So, und wie Sie, liebe Gäste, mitbekommen haben, haben wir hier ein internationales Programm. Japan, davor jetzt hier Türkei und unser nächster Gast wird aus Rom, aus Italien zugeschaltet sein. Er wird seinen Vortrag auf Englisch halten und daher zunächst die Frage an Sie. Ist es in Ordnung, wenn er diesen Vortrag ohne Übersetzung hält? Ja? Also einmal mit Handzeichen. Für wen ist es in Ordnung, wenn er diesen Vortrag auf Englisch hält ohne Übersetzung? Okay. Und die anderen kommen zu Ulrike. So machen wir's. Also, dann noch ein paar Sätze zu, unserem nächsten Gast. Thomas Fazi wurde 1982 in Rom geboren. Er lebt aktuell in Italien. Seine berufliche Identität umfasst mehrere Rollen. Er ist Journalist, Autor, Dokumentarfilmer und Übersetzer. Und aus zeitlichen Gründen würde ich sagen, legen wir los. Dear Thomas, thank you so much for your time. Best greetings from Rüsselsheim in Germany and hello to Italy. You need to, sorry, Thomas, you are muted. You are muted.
So sorry.
No, now we
Sorry.
can
you hear me now? Okay. Sorry. Yes. No, I was saying, well, first of all, I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks a lot for having me here. And I really want to thank all of you organizers, for putting together this important event, which I hope will mark the beginning of a more structured pan-European anti-war movement, which we desperately need in Europe. And I apologize for not speaking German. And I also apologize that I won't be able to take any questions at the end because I'm running on a bit of a tight schedule. So I apologize for that. So are we going to have the translation or should I just go ahead in English?
You can just go ahead in English.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Slowly, as slow as possible.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so today, I'd like to use my time to address an idea that until recently, most people probably would have considered unthinkable, even most people in this room, perhaps even heretical. And maybe some of you still do. And that is the idea that the European Union, far from being the guarantor of peace and prosperity and democracy that it claims to be, has in fact become the greatest threat to peace, prosperity, and democracy on the continent. And indeed, I would argue, has become so fundamentally misaligned with the interests of the European peoples that the only responsible path left is to dismantle it, ideally uh, in a coordinated manner, or alternatively for individual countries to take the lead in abandoning the European Union. Now, this may sound provocative and maybe excessively radical, but I think it's really the only possible conclusion that we can draw after more than 3 decades of what I would consider to be empirical evidence. We have tried reforming the European Union. We have tried, more Europe. We have pinned our hopes on new treaties, institutions, slogans, you name it. And what have we achieved? We have achieved economic stagnation, geopolitical irrelevance for Europe, and indeed, today, an unprecedented level of hyper-vassalization to the United States. Europe today is more vassalized to the US than it's ever been in its entire post-war history. We've achieved we've got a hollowing out of democracy and popular sovereignty. And in fact, I would say we see increasingly a drift into outright authoritarianism, with almost a creeping totalitarian logic, really now running through the EU's laws, policies, and its institutional culture more in general. Um, so I would say that the EU has not simply failed, and I think, in fact, failure is not the right word because I would argue that it has what we're seeing now was, in many respects, what the EU was meant to achieve. Um, but I would say it has failed in a way that makes reform impossible because its very architecture guarantees this failure, if we want to call it failure. And this is why I would say that this architecture, because it cannot be reformed, must go. It must be dismantled. And I'd like to begin where Europe's current tragedy begins, and that is with the issue of hyper-vassalization. Um, as we know, after the end of the Cold War, a window of opportunity opened that could potentially have paved the way for a sovereign Europe, something which the continent had never been since the end of the war, divided as it was between two foreign powers, the US and the Soviet Union. And instead, tragically, um, Europe moved in the opposite direction. In the uh, beginning in the 90s, it started becoming more of a protectorate. It became more subordinated, progressively more subordinated to the US, precisely at the moment, at the time in history when the EU was born, when this institution that was supposed to act as um, a counterbalance to American power was created. And this, I think, might appear paradoxical, but in fact, if you follow my reasoning, I think it will emerge quite clearly at the end that this was not a coincidence, in fact, and that this was the inevitable outcome of the European Union. Um, the U.S., as we know, in the post-war era, viewed the Soviet collapse not as an opportunity for peace and for healing, but as an opportunity for hegemony and unipolarity. NATO, as we know, which should have dissolved with the end of the Cold War, was in fact not only not dissolved, but in fact was preserved and expanded eastward. And the EU marched in lockstep with the US on this. Indeed, uh, as we know, accession to the European Union for the countries of Eastern Europe became conditional on joining NATO, effectively making Brussels an auxiliary pillar to Washington's unipolar order. And I think this was not a new development. From as early as the late 1940s, the US, in fact, had actively promoted European integration as part of its strategy to contain the Soviet Union. The American Committee on United Europe, the ACUE, which was essentially a CIA front, covertly financed pro-integration movements and political actors in Europe. And the aim was quite clear: to create a unified capitalist Western Europe, economically aligned with the US, militarily subordinated to it through NATO, and divided from Russia. And this overarching strategic US goal when it comes to Europe remained true even after the creation of the European Union. And I would say it remained truer than ever, in fact. And so we shouldn't be surprised that over the past decades, and especially the past years, the EU has served this strategy. It has served the US's strategic goals with such zeal, all the way from Yugoslavia to NATO expansion to Ukraine today. Um, and so, of course, the culmination of this logic came in the years leading up to and following the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. Instead of trying to stop a catastrophic war on its continent, the EU became the loudest cheerleader of the idea of using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken and bleed Russia, as they like to put it. In the process, it completely destroyed its energy infrastructure. It crippled its industry. It sent energy prices skyrocketing through the roof, and it really relinquished what little autonomy it had left in foreign security and diplomatic policy. And this was really quite astonishing. I mean, never before in modern history has a supposedly sovereign bloc uh, totally sabotaged its economic foundations so eagerly and so enthusiastically to essentially serve a foreign power, i.e., the US. And in fact, in recent years, on virtually every major issue, trade, energy, defense, foreign policy, you name it, the EU has consistently acted against the interests of European countries in order to comply with Washington's strategic agenda or outright diktats, one might say. If we take, for example, the recent EU US trade deal, which many have rightly described as a complete capitulation on the EU side. And I think nothing really illustrates this subordination of Europe to the US better than Europe's silence and likely complicity in the Nord Stream bombing, an attack that was almost certainly executed by the US or one or more of its NATO proxies. No sovereign region, no sovereign country would tolerate such an act. This was the worst act of industrial terrorism ever committed on European soil. But Europe, and more specifically Germany, did tolerate it, and in fact continues to engage in effectively covering up the real culprits of the bombing. And more in general, today we can all see that the EU is at the forefront of the push for war, the push for the militarization of European societies. And perhaps most shamefully, it dresses all this with the language of strategic autonomy, of gaining greater autonomy from Trump's America, when it is simply further subordinating the US to the goals of the pro-war Atlantic establishment, which continues to um, be incredibly powerful in the US, despite Trump being in the White House. And in fact, I would say that the EU today is acting as a primary institutional vehicle of that pro-war Atlantic establishment. But I think it's important to understand that this complete loss of sovereignty is not accidental. I would argue that it is structural. It is, in fact, built into the DNA of the European Union. Defenders of the EU and sometimes even its critics often blame its failures on unfortunate circumstances or its, you know, its flawed construction or poor leadership. But in fact, the reality, I think, is much simpler, and that is that the EU doesn't work, at least not in the way that most Europeans would want it to work, because it cannot work. Its supranational architecture removes core economic, monetary, and political powers from democratic institutions, and it relocates these powers to technocratic bodies which are unaccountable to voters and often are even unaccountable to democratically elected governments. And this democratic vacuum inevitably ends up being filled by oligarchic and financial and military and transatlantic interests. This is inevitable. And if this was done by design, I would argue. And even if you look just at the EU from an economic perspective, the results are just as catastrophic. I mean, for decades, if you look at a single market over the course of the past 4 decades, the single market has in fact failed to raise Europe's growth trajectory, especially compared to comparable economies. Mostly, first and foremost, the US. So the European and US economies for a long time, marched in lockstep, and then we see the trajectory of the two economies, the EU and the US, starting to diverge quite clearly in the early 2000s, and especially after the 2008 crisis. And this brings me to my second point, which is the euro. Even once we can discuss all the limits of the European Union and the single market and the pros and cons, but I think there is absolutely no question whatsoever that the euro, the single currency, has been another disaster for Europe. It has imposed a rigid, one-size-fits-all monetary and fiscal framework, which prevents countries from pursuing independent policies suited to their needs. And it's a model that might have served some countries for a while. One may argue that it served Germany's economy, or I would say certain sectors of the German economy for a while. It hollowed out in the 2000 in the early 2000s Southern Europe's industrial base, while kind of entrenching a German mercantilist model. But now we see that this model is also collapsing, and I would say partly also as a result of the failures of the single currency. And then on top of that, we have the incredibly complex array of state aid rules and various regulations that severely hinder Europe's ability to engage in industrial policy. And then on top of that, we have this incredibly complex multi-level bureaucracy, which really leaves Europe completely unable to compete, especially in this new 21st century environment where the US and China and other countries rely very heavily on strategic state intervention. And this is a very volatile environment, which would require an ability to make swift decisions and to engage flexibly with this world in flux. But the EU makes this impossible. And so I would say that the EU, that Europe's economic weakness and the geopolitical irrelevance that partly stems from this are the direct product of the EU's institutional architecture. And in the same way, the democratic hollowing out, the democratic erosion that we have experienced since the creation of the EU should not be understood as a bug. The so-called democratic deficit of the EU, as if this were simply a mistake to be fixed. But it shouldn't be understood as a core feature of the EU and of the integrationist project, which had at its core, as one of the core objectives of many of those who championed for the creation of the European Union, precisely this transfer of
Dear
of
Thomas,
the decision-making
please
process
keep time
from
in
the
mind.
national level, where
Thomas,
you had at least a degree of democratic accountability and control, to the supranational level, which is unaccountable and undemocratic by definition. And if we look at who wields the power today in the European Union, we have the Commission, which is totally unelected and unaccountable to voters and citizens. We have the ECB for the countries that have the euro, incredibly powerful institution, which is completely untouchable and, in fact, insulated from any form of democratic control.
Dear
We have
Thomas,
the EU
please
Court of
keep
Justice
the time in
often
mind.
imposes its rulings on national courts, often overriding democratically approved policies. And then we have laws which are negotiated in opaque trilogues, which no one really understands how they work, and it's all done completely behind closed doors and beyond public scrutiny. And so I think it's
Dear
pretty
Thomas,
clear
can you
that
hear
this
us? Can you hear me?
this is a system that has nothing to do with democracy whatsoever. It's not even a system that can be democratized, I would argue, because it was conceived as a post-democratic, and I would say anti-democratic form of governance that was precisely designed to neuter popular sovereignty. And I think in recent years, something even more troubling has emerged,
Yeah.
and that is the fact that the EU has become mutated from only a technocratic, post-democratic system into an openly punitive and authoritarian regime. And I'll just highlight a few examples. In recent years, the EU has built a machinery of narrative control that is almost unprecedented in the post-war Western world, which really elevates censorship, especially online censorship, to a new democratic norm. And the most striking example is the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which empowers the Commission to force platforms to remove any content that it judges illegal or that it judges to be disinformation or fake news, effectively outsourcing censorship to private companies under the threat of massive fines. And then we have the new European Democracy
Yeah,
Shield,
Thomas, can you hear us?
which the Commission is pushing forward. And this goes even further by establishing a supranational monitoring center to identify and suppress so-called fake content online, by expanding EU-funded so-called fact-checking networks and by integrating NGOs and media outlets that are dependent on EU funding into a continent-wide censorship infrastructure. And all this is done in the name of fighting foreign interference, but the real goal, I think, is clear, and that is to shape and control the narrative by censoring dissenting and non-aligned voices. And this is disturbing in itself, but censorship is only one side of the equation. The other side is propaganda. And in fact, sort of parallel to the censorship system, the EU has also built a comprehensive ecosystem of propaganda through which it shapes public opinion. And over the past decade, Brussels has really built an entire, ecosystem of narrative production. So what we have is NGOs, think tanks, media outlets, universities, all formally independent and branded as civil society, which have been systematically absorbed into a machinery whose purpose is to manufacture consent for the EU's agenda. So, for example, through the SERV program, that's CERV, Brussels funds thousands of NGOs to the tune of
So,
hundreds of
Thomas,
millions
hörst du
of
mich?
euros every year.
Also wir haben
NGOs
extra gesagt, er soll
tasked
sich
with
kurz
promoting
fassen.
European values,
Und
combating
da ich ja selbst
skepticism,
Italiener bin,
raising trust in the EU,
darf ich
and
das sagen,
in
wir
general
können das
promoting
nicht.
the EU's
Jetzt, er müsste uns hören, aber er ist wahrscheinlich im Tunnel.
And these NGOs, which are often
Die Frage
entirely
ist, ob wir ihn jetzt
dependent on EU money,
abblocken, aber
effectively act
dann
as
ist das
conveyor
natürlich eine
belts of
Beleidigung, ja.
pro-EU and in recent years increasingly of pro-NATO
Ja,
message.
er muss um halb die Kinder zur Oma bringen. Also so viel Zeit lassen wir ihm noch, damit wir ihn nicht beleidigen.
Media is also very entangled. Brussels spends tens of millions each year to subsidize news outlets, again, to raise awareness of the benefits of EU policies. And academia is also involved. The Jean Monnet program, for example, acts across hundreds of universities to promote EU integration as an ideological mission, turning professors into ambassadors of the European project, and promoting countless projects across European universities and institutions, again, effectively aimed at promoting the EU's agenda. And so what emerges really is a kind of neo-totalitarian narrative regime where on the one hand, censorship eliminates unwanted voices while propaganda floods the information space with establishment-approved voices. But Brussels is nowadays no longer content with just controlling the narrative through censorship and propaganda. It now wants to intrude into our very own private conversations as well. Just the other day, the COPA, which is the council's body that does the technical groundwork for the new laws and regulations, greenlighted the Commission's proposed chat control regulation, which could potentially, and this is its aim, enable the mass scanning of all private communications. No Western democracy has ever attempted anything comparable, but this is exactly what the EU is now pushing for. This is presented as child protection. We need to scan every single message and photo in order to search for images or evidence of child sexual abuse. But there are, of course, other ways of doing this. This is, in fact, I think clearly aimed at creating a permanent surveillance infrastructure unparalleled in at least in the Western world. And then aside from all these already disturbing developments, I think we're seeing a particularly worrying issue, which is the growing outright repression, not just the censorship, but the outright repression and persecution of dissent in Europe. The EU now sanctions journalists, including EU citizens, without due process or meaningful evidence. And what we see is that effectively merely criticizing EU foreign policy can and will get you labeled a threat to security. And this is something, and you will be dealt with appropriately as a quasi-terrorist risk. And this is something that would have been unthinkable in Western Europe, even at the height of the Cold War anti-Soviet paranoia. So this is these are just some brief examples of just this really incredibly disturbing authoritarian crackdown that we are witnessing in Europe, pushed by the European Union. And then we have, the various measures that the EU is coming up with to, again, as I mentioned, fight
can you
foreign
hear
interference.
Thank you
The
so
EU
much
loves to talk about Russian foreign interference.
for
but in
your
fact, there's
presentation,
no actor
but
interferes
we
more
need to move
aggressively
on.
in the democratic.
Okay.
Du musst die Kinder abholen.
Wir hatten ihm eigentlich im Vorhinein gesagt 10 Minuten, aber wenn ein Italiener mal ins Reden kommt, ihr wisst, wie das ist, ja? Also, ich hoffe, Sie konnten trotzdem etwas aus dem Vortrag von ihm mitnehmen. Es sollten 10 Minuten sein, am Ende wurde es jetzt über eine halbe Stunde und er redet immer noch weiter, wie ich gerade sehe. Ja,